The world of the past was often a perilous place filled with dangers of all kinds, from deadly diseases and natural disasters to daily violence and widespread warfare. And where there are dangers, there are also injuries. Whether it was a simple accident or a trauma sustained on the battlefield, the people of history were never far away from a wound or an injury, and rulers were no exception. This is the first in a series of videos on the many wounded leaders throughout history. This is the retelling. Near the end of Alexander the Great's world-conquering campaign, after he had destroyed empires, subjugated kingdoms, and even possibly seen a dragon, the great king was ready to press on still further, beyond the borders of any map. However, his army was too tired and too homesick to go any further. Faced with this, as well as several ill omens in the entrails of sacrifices, Alexander the Great was forced to turn his back on the east and plot his course for home. Only he would not be retracing his steps and returning by the same route in which he had come. Instead, he would move west through more unconquered lands and continue his world-conquering tour on his return trip back to Greece. It was during this time along his route through the Punjab that Alexander and his armies encountered one of the hardest struggles of their long campaign when they entered the realm of the Mali. The Mali, like many people before them, had attempted to resist Alexander's invasion. Like all others, however, they too were no match for Alexander. The campaign against the Mali was a brutal and decisive one, with Alexander defeating his enemies through a series of stunning marches and rapid sieges. By this time, there was perhaps no army in the world as capable and as effective as Alexander's. For a decade, they had been fighting and conquering, honing their skills in battlefield maneuvers and siegecraft. There was no army more practiced in undermining walls or more skilled in the use of siege engines, from simple ladders to mighty siege towers and early forms of catapults. As Alexander and his army made their way deeper into the Mali territory, more and more cities fell to the conqueror, their populations being either enslaved or put to the sword. On this far-flung corner of the map, Alexander was taking no chances. His supply lines were vulnerable, and his enemies could not be allowed to live. Whereas in the past, Alexander had been more magnanimous in victory, here, against the Mali, there was little mercy to be had. As Alexander's armies approached a Mali settlement, the Malians would generally retreat, first behind the walls of their city, then retreat further into a more defensible citadel within the city. There they would soon fall victim to Alexander's engineers and sappers. Their walls would crumble or be climbed over, and they would be killed. It was at one of these cities, during one of these sieges, that Alexander the Great was very seriously wounded and almost lost his life. The exact name and location of this city are unknown today, although the account of what happened there is not disputed. The story goes that, having gained access to the outer walls of the city, Alexander, leading from the front, led his men deeper into the city, where they soon found themselves up against the citadel wall. Here, the tedious process of laying siege started again, with the defenders on the walls hurling javelins and shooting arrows down at the attackers, who bore ladders, hooks and axes, and shovels. Under constant attack from the walls above, Alexander's men assaulted the walls and the gates of the citadel, readying ladders and battering rams. Alexander himself would have witnessed the scene, men he had commanded and known for years being wounded and killed as they did their best to break the enemy. Alexander's army may have been the most practiced and the most skilled in siegecraft at the time, but laying siege to any settlement takes time. Sieges could be long and costly affairs, a lesson Alexander had already learned long ago. As he observed his men struggle to attack the walls, the great king grew frustrated at the progress of the siege. For every moment that dragged by, more of his men fell. The defenders threw everything they had from atop the walls: arrows, stones, spears, and any tired, worn-out Greek, strong enough to get himself up a ladder and onto the walls, didn't last long against the mass of defenders that would be waiting for him. Alexander was many things, including a soldier. He could not just stand idly by while his men were wounded and killed by enemies atop the walls. Soon his frustration got the better of him, and he charged at the walls of the citadel himself, taking off so quickly that he was only accompanied by his attendant Bucestus and his bodyguard Leonatus. Holding his shield in front of him, Alexander scooped up one of the siege ladders and ran it at the walls of the citadel, warding off attacks from above and setting the ladder to the walls. The great king didn't pause as he stepped onto the rungs and started to climb, while just behind him Bucestus followed, carrying a sacred shield that Alexander had taken from a temple of Athena at Troy. Following Bucestus, Leonatus also climbed, and behind him a brave common soldier called Abraeus climbed as well. Together the four men scaled the walls of the citadel, warding off arrows and falling stones as they worked their way up, rung by rung. Cresting the walls, Alexander drew his sword and began hacking and slashing at the defending Malians, killing several of them. By his side, Bucestus deflected attacks with the sacred shield, and before long, Leonatus and Abraeus were also atop the wall, fighting alongside their king. The Malians, recognizing Alexander for who he was, redoubled their attacks, surging at the foreign king with everything they had, but failing to score a lethal blow on Alexander or any of his three brave companions. The defenders scrambled for Alexander, all while arrows and sling stones would have zipped close by or struck other Malians crowded around the four Greeks. Meanwhile, below the walls, the remainder of Alexander's army watched in shame as their king not only mounted the walls, but was beginning to clear them of defenders. Emboldened by this and spurred by their shame, Alexander's men charged the walls after their king, each man eagerly reaching and clawing for the ladder up the walls. Before long, there were so many soldiers clambering up the ladder that it began to bow and bend under their weight. Then it collapsed. Before the first of the soldiers could make it up the wall, he and all the others behind him went tumbling back down again. And just like that, Alexander and his three men were trapped on the walls of the Malian citadel. Alexander and the others with him were more than capable fighters, but they couldn't take on the entirety of the Malian defenders alone. Soon they would be surrounded. Then they would be killed. Recognizing this, Alexander leapt from the walls down into the city, and, putting his back to a tree, he began fighting off any Malian who came close to him. One challenger ran forward and was quickly dispatched, while a second one swung his sword wildly and was killed. Then a third soon followed. It soon became clear to all the Malians who were not yet aware that Alexander was an exceptional warrior. Back outside the walls, Alexander's men were in a panicked frenzy. Seeing their king disappear from the walls down into the city stirred them into a violent, desperate craze. These were men who loved Alexander and who needed him to guide them back to their far-off homeland. Alexander's men hacked at the gates with axes and clawed at the walls with whatever they could find. Several Greeks even scaled the mud brick defenses by slamming pegs into the walls and climbing them to reach the top. Others climbed on the shoulders of their comrades, reaching for the ramparts with their bare hands. Meanwhile, atop the walls, the three men who had scaled the ladder behind Alexander, Bucestus, Leonatus, and Abraeus, saw the danger that their king was in, and they too leapt down into the city after him. Alexander, with his back to a tree, had killed enough Malians that the others had backed off and formed a semicircle around the king. They hurled spears and rocks at Alexander, who deflected the missiles as best as he could. As the attacks intensified, Alexander was joined by his 3 comrades, who had fought their way to his side. At that point, Abraeus was struck in the face with an arrow, and he was killed. Alexander, Pusestus, and Leonatus did their best to deflect incoming attacks, but they simply would not have been able to block every arrow or stone. It was then that Alexander was struck with an arrow through his side, punching through his armor and deep into his chest, possibly even puncturing a lung. Gravely wounded, Alexander did his best to defend himself against the continuing hail of attacks, but he was bleeding heavily and losing strength. Soon he collapsed. Seeing the great king fall, the Malians let out a cry of triumph, and they must have surged forward, feeling that victory was close. Pusestus and Leonatus, both likely wounded and exhausted themselves, stood over Alexander and faced down impossible odds. It was 2 men against hundreds, but not for long. Alexander's army, maddened at the thought of their beloved king alone against the enemy, or worse, already dead, had finally managed to breach the walls of the citadel. They stormed over the walls, broke open the gates, and charged over the defenders. When Alexander's men reached their king, they found him unconscious and in a state very near death, but Pusestus and Leonatus still defended his body. Enraged and fearing that Alexander was indeed dead, his army overwhelmed the last of the Mali defenders without mercy, slaughtering everyone they came across, including women and children. Alexander, meanwhile, was carefully lifted onto a shield and brought to his ship, where surgery was performed to remove the arrow lodged in his chest. Though he was out of the fight, Alexander was still very much in danger. No surgery of the day was without its risks, and without anesthetics, the operation would have been agonizing. As the operation to remove the arrow was carried out, sounds of violence and destruction echoed out from the burning citadel not far away. The rage and fury of Alexander's men was savage, and it was unchecked. As the sun set on the burning citadel, they ran from building to building, killing everyone. Meanwhile, back on the great king's boat, the arrow had been cut free from Alexander's chest, but Alexander himself was in very bad shape, and the danger was still far from over. As night fell, sounds of wailing and grieving went up from the camp around Alexander's boat. His men and followers wept and cried for their king. They feared he was dead. In a far-off land, impossible leagues from home, they feared that their great king was killed and that no one could bring them home. Rumors swirled and whispers began to murmur that Alexander was already dead. His soldiers were not learned healers or physicians, but they were veteran soldiers, and they knew well battlefield wounds. They would have seen wounds like Alexander's before, and they would have known that the odds of survival were not in his favor. All through the night, cries of mourning rang out from every corner of Alexander's camp. Prayers would have been said and sacrifices made. The night turned to day, and still there was no word from Alexander or his companions. A screen of curtains shaded the deck of his boat and blocked any view of the happenings on board. The days continued to pass. Rumors continued to spread. Eventually, Alexander's companions came forward to declare that the king was in fact alive, but with no sign of Alexander himself, the army was naturally skeptical. The passing days turned to weeks, and news of Alexander's death spread to the other parts of his army, led by his companions. The campaign against the Mali was all but completed and had become a distant afterthought in the shadow of Alexander's condition and rumors of his death. Somehow, against all odds, Alexander the Great had survived. To quell any rumors of his death, Alexander was loaded onto a litter and brought out onto the deck of his ship so that the assembled army could see him. Pale and unmoving, he must have looked dead. With the utmost delicacy, Alexander was carried from his ship down a ramp to the bank of the river. There, he raised his hand and waved to the army, causing them to erupt with cheers. They clapped and chanted for their miraculously healed king, some of them falling to the ground, weeping with relief. In a further show of strength, Alexander climbed from the litter he was carried on, and he mounted a horse, riding it slowly a brief distance through the camp to the rapturous cheers of his soldiers and the cringing grimaces of his physicians. Alexander was showered with flowers and praise as he steered his mount toward his tent. Dismounting, he walked under his own strength through the entrance of his tent, where he no doubt fell into his bed, aching and exhausted. Injured as he was, Alexander had done what he needed to do. He had proved to his army that he was, in fact, still alive. An arrow had pierced his chest in the heat of battle, and maybe collapsed a lung, but somehow Alexander the Great had survived. Alexander would never fully recover from the wound he had sustained. It's difficult enough coming back from something like that today, and this was the mid-320s BC. After recovering from the wound, Alexander was chastised by his friends and commanders. It was not the king's place, they told him, to risk his life in so reckless an action. What would the army have done if he had been killed, they asked. What would have become of his kingdom? Frustrated and angered by this lecture, Alexander stormed from his tent and stalked out into the camp, where he was confronted by an old soldier who had overheard Alexander's companions lecturing him. The old soldier was a veteran from central Greece who had followed Alexander across the known world and who had fought for him in some of the greatest battles of all time. The old veteran said, "Alexander, brave deeds are what true men do." Alexander embraced the old man, and they became friends. The events at the Malian citadel would be some of Alexander's last actions of personal bravery in battle. Never again would he be the first through a breach or over a wall. He would die only 2 years later. Alexander the Great was a fighter and a soldier. Though he must have suffered many scrapes and cuts in his campaigns, even cheating death on several occasions, there was no wound he suffered that was more severe or more life-threatening than the arrow at the Malian citadel. The story of Alexander the Great at the Malian citadel and the fact that he survived the wound he obtained there are just two small elements that make up the truly great story of Alexander. Hey, thanks for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. There are more stories of wounded kings and rulers out there, so let me know if you'd like to see more. A big thank you to everyone supporting the channel. It really means a lot. Anyways, I'll see you in the next one.